on small farms. And I'm excited to be over here to really specifically focus in on small farms because yesterday I'm the policy coordinator for the Land Workers Alliance. Myself and others met with the Minister, Mark Spencer, to try and talk about farming policy, and small farms came up quite a lot because there was an announcement yesterday by DEFRA that they're going to give £20 per hectare up to the first 50 hectares as a top-up payment for small farms to try and support small farms. And that seemed like the first time in a long time there's been any kind of support or acknowledgement of how important small farms are to reverse this trend that's been going on for quite a while that has said to small farms, basically get bigger or get out. There's been, for decades, there's been underinvestment in small farms. And we all recognize that there's huge community, social, economic benefits to small farms, that often small farms are real havens for wildlife. You might have big fields in an area, where the margins might have places for wildlife across them. But on a small farm, might be a real oasis right in the middle where you've got loads of diversity, both agro-biodiversity of different sorts of crops or orchard trees or whatever it is, and spaces for wildlife there at the same time. Lots of diversity of different things going on that provide all those extra little spaces for wildlife to have a safe haven, but also a place for the community to come to and connect to where our food has come from, to try and provide local employment, to have a place to get fresh, healthy food, and also to have a space where people can actually connect with that wildlife as well for their own mental health and for their own, ability to breathe fresh air and to understand, that sense of community that comes from a small farming community that's truly alive and truly vibrant. So for the last 2 decades or so, small farms have really been underinvested in, and that comes from everything from the grant schemes that are available. Often grant schemes are all about very high-tech equipment. The threshold for how much you can borrow is often very high, and the equipment's just not suitable to small farms. And then the amount that you have to borrow just nothing relates to the model of farming that you're actually trying to do. But also the subsidy system. And when we in 2013, Owen Paterson decided, and this is in England itself, decided that he was going to set a threshold for the size of the holding to be able to claim the subsidy payments from CAP. And when he did that, automatically that excluded 18,000 landowners, small commercial farms, from receiving any form of financial subsidy. So that's clear exclusion and clear discrimination, because they were in this idea that we're going to try and consolidate small farms, we're going to try and modernize small farms and force small farms to get bigger or get out of the industry. And since then, because of that and because of the huge increase in the price of land that's been driven by these subsidies that support large landowners over the small intensive units, we've lost over 35,000 small farms since 2005. So there's a severe decline in the small farms. And then we also really see that the way that the subsidy is distributed is very much going towards the arable sector and towards extensive livestock with large holdings, where it's close to less than 1 to 2% of that funding actually goes to support horticulture for our fresh fruit and vegetables and the hard work that people on market gardens do to supply fresh fruit and vegetables to the local communities. It also excludes the pig and poultry sector, who are often quite small and quite intensive because you can do them on a small land area. And so those industries don't get the support they need. And they're very vulnerable at the moment because they're at danger, if they've got high standards, of being undercut by cheap imports from factory farms that can come in with battery farm chicken, pigs raised to very, very low animal welfare standards, and multinationals that are producing these things and churning them out. And if our government's not putting those standards in place, that means that they can be undercut. So all these things mean is that we've really got to reverse this trend because it's becoming more and more recognized how important these small farms are to our communities. And each of our speakers today is going to talk about, in the devolved nation context, what those policies can start to look like that truly support small farms. We just had a session with DEFRA where we were talking about, the fact that they should be supporting moves towards agro-biodiversity. If you're a small farm and you're preserving agro-biodiversity, you should get payments for that. Or if you engage the public, that you can get payments for that. And all these sorts of creative solutions. So I'm going to pass you on to our speakers who can talk about, in each devolved nation context, the importance of small farms, what they're doing, and what we can do to support them. And these are all our wonderful policy people for the Land Workers Alliance doing the good work every day.
And Bridget.
And Bridget. So who goes first?
Yes, Tara.
Tara.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Tara Wight. I'm the Scotland Policy and Campaigns Coordinator for the Land Workers Alliance. I'm going to be talking a bit about, I'll give some kind of background context to the farming system in Scotland and then talk a bit about what we've got at the moment, what's being proposed and kind of what we're doing with the Land Workers Alliance and the organisations we work with and the farmers we work with to try and make things a little bit better. So first of all, a little bit of context about the land system in Scotland. We have the most concentrated system of land ownership in Europe and the second most concentrated in the world. It's actually the only place in the world, I think, where technically the main system of land ownership is still feudalism. Carbon, we've got there's a lot of carbon speculation, carbon credit schemes, rewilding projects by large corporations. So this is really driving land prices up at a really astonishing rate. The average farm size is high. 220 hectares is the average farm size, partly because a lot of areas are very remote. People have big amounts of land in those areas. But despite the fact that the average farm size is so high, we do have 20,000 of what the Scottish Government would call small holdings and 20,000 crofts. So we do have lots and lots of small farms. I think it's also worth noting that there's quite a big difference between the Highlands and the Lowlands in Scotland, both in terms of the history of land and farming, the cultural context, and also the current policy is quite different for small farms and crofts between the two. So one of the really exciting things that we have in Scotland, which is unique, is that we have the crofting system. This is only present in the Highlands and Islands. You can see them in the map. At the bottom, you can see the crofting counties in red, so this system applies across those counties. I think we often think that this is, a really ancient system, but actually this was brought in after the clearances to some extent to appease the people that were cleared off the land. So while it's great that we have this, it doesn't really answer to the kind of atrocities that happened in the Highlands. It was brought in with the Crofters Holding Act of 1886. And it guarantees secure tenure, fair rates for the land, and a right to pass on or bequeath tenancy. And more recently, it also has been expanded to include a right to buy your croft as well, although that has led to various challenges. Most crofters will have their own small amount of land that's private, that they kind of croft themselves. These vary in size from about 0.5 to 50 hectares, but usually the average is about 5 hectares. And then they also come with a share of what's called common grazing, which is all the crofters in an area have a share of a much bigger bit of land, which they cooperatively graze. So this is quite radical, an example of the commons that still exists and is kind of in practice. So the crofting system is great in many ways. It's really exciting. But there are various challenges. Access to crofts is becoming a real challenge, partly because people sell their tenancies because you can pass them on to people. The price of tenancies is now, while the actual rental prices are not that expensive, the price of a tenancy in the first place is skyrocketing. So actually getting a croft at all is really hard. There's also a huge amount of admin involved in running a croft, both from the crofter's perspective in terms of applying for all the grants and keeping yourself with all registered, but also from the Crofting Commission perspective, who do a large amount of admin keeping track of all the detail about all these crofts, perhaps more than needs to be done. And also the crofting is considered by the Scottish Government to be kind of its own, or this is my impression, to be kind of its own special thing and a bit separate and not really part of Scotland's main agricultural system, and so is often kind of forgotten about to some extent. So it's quite important in Scotland when talking about. I can hear. Is everything? When talking about agriculture, that we're talking about farming and crofting, not just farming. Just in terms of devolution in the EU, it's worth, I probably should have said this at the beginning, but agriculture, land and environmental policy are all devolved to the Scottish Parliament, so they can differ quite drastically from what's happening across other parts of the UK. One of the key differences is that the Scottish Government has explicitly stated that they aim to rejoin the EU after independence. And because of this, that they plan to keep agricultural policy broadly aligned with the common agricultural policy in the EU. It's also worth noting that the Scottish Government really wants to come across as progressive. So this is slightly different from some of the other countries that we'll be hearing from. They say a lot of really good things. They love phrases like just transition and climate justice, regenerative. They absolutely love it. So it's a slightly different, they want to use the language. It's just a lot of my job is kind of questioning whether what they mean by the language is what we think they should mean by the language, because it often isn't. So what we've got for small farms in Scotland at the moment, small farms and crofts, so across Scotland generally, the subsidy system is mostly area-based payments, as it's still kind of going from what we had with the cap before. The minimum size threshold to receive these payments is 3 hectares, which is perhaps slightly better than England, but still pretty high, and does exclude quite a lot of Land Workers Alliance members, for example, who work in small-scale horticulture. And that applies across pretty much all grants that you can get, including the small farms capital grants, which are also only available to those who have less than £32,000 in income. So that's kind of where we're at. I think there's some funding for sort of sustainability and organic conversion for smaller farms than that, but it's not very much. Then we've got the crofting specific legislation. And crofters can apply for the crofting agricultural grant scheme, which is up to £25,000 every 2 years, and that doesn't come with an income cap. They can also apply for funding to rebuild or build from scratch or improve a house on their croft. One of the things with crofting is you have to live within 32 miles of your croft. So there's a grant for housing. And also you can count the common grazing land towards your total area, which means that in terms of the area-based payments, crofters with access to common grazing can sometimes really benefit from that. So there are definitely some benefits for crofters that we don't see in other parts of the country under the current system. But as I said, it's often a very heavy admin burden for people who are farming at very small scale. We've got the Scottish Agriculture Bill is going through Parliament at the moment. We've just finished the public consultation phase. And this is what's going to replace CAP, basically. It's really slow. We're a long way behind what's happening in the rest of the countries in the UK. And it's still really, really vague. They're proposing a 4-tiered payment system, the first tier of which is going to be specifically income support, which I think is really important. But the income support is going to be based on the area of land that you farm. It's going to be an area-based payment, which means that you get more income the more land you own, which to me seems like pretty blatant discrimination. Most payments are still area-based. There's no targets included in the Agriculture Bill. And most of the things to do with conditionality for helping the environment, for example, won't actually come into place until 2026. So what we're looking at is a very delayed process of transitioning towards more sustainable agriculture. And the Scottish Government is almost certainly going to miss its carbon targets in terms of agriculture. Basically, it's vague, it's unambitious, and to be honest, I think it's less progressive than the more updated versions of CAP. I think they've based it on the older version of CAP, and it doesn't include things like a mandatory redistributive payment. They're saying there's a mechanism for redistributive payments at some point, but not till at least 2026. And the new CAP has a requirement for that. So yeah, it's not quite what we were hoping for. The other policy that I won't talk too much about this because I realise I'm running out of time. The other policy that's relevant for small-scale farms is that we've had the Land Reform Bill going through consultation this year. And the proposals for this include a public interest test for sale of large amounts of land, some responsibilities for landowners, and some strengthening of the community right to buy. The main issue with this is that currently the proposals only apply to very large pieces of land, which are over 3,000 hectares. So I think it's hard to see at this point how this will have any impact really at all on small-scale farming. It's also potentially not going to apply to agricultural land. They're not going to apply it to family farms, which covers quite a lot of agricultural land. And there's a major focus on net zero, which could lead to more of this kind of carbon speculation and carbon credit schemes pushing up land prices. So while there's some potentially good ideas in there, in its current form, I think it's not going to achieve what we'd like it to. There's various other policies going through at the moment that are relevant. There's a Good Food Nation, local food strategy, biodiversity strategy, and the circular economy bill, which could all be relevant. The Scottish Government is quite disjointed in terms of working on this. There's not that much crossover in between the different policies, even though there should be. This is partly because they're quite under-resourced compared to, for example, Westminster, but it is an area that then I think needs more consideration. So in terms of what we're asking for in Scotland, we're asking for an end to area-based payments because they are not fair. And we've been proposing a universal basic income for active farmers instead. The Scottish Government is really interested in the idea of universal basic income generally, so we've been proposing that this could be a good place in which to trial that, would be with farmers. And if income payments are important, then it should be fair across everybody. We're campaigning to remove the minimum farm size threshold to receive subsidies, to expand crofting legislation across the country so that small-scale farmers in other parts of the country also have access to the rights that crofters have. Changes to the Land Reform Bill to support creation of small farms, and a moratorium on carbon credit schemes until there's better regulation. So that's kind of where we've got more to work out in terms of asks for that, but something needs to be done soon. In terms of how we're going about working on this, this year we formed the Scottish Agroecology Action Group with the Nature Friendly Farming Network, the Scottish Crofting Federation, the Soil Association and Propagate. And we're lobbying and campaigning together because we're all those organisations have maybe quite, other than the Crofting Federation, are UK based, so we don't have that much capacity in Scotland, so we're trying to work together. And the main thing that we're working on is developing a campaign for small farms and crofts. The asks of that campaign will be kind of things that are useful to all of the organisations. So some of them we're going to focus more on the redistributive payment than we've been focusing on in our own Land Workers Alliance specific campaigning, and the need for that to come in sooner, for example, because that's relevant to all the organisations. What we've done so far, we had a day of action for small farms and crofts. So actually, I think it was our first Scotland-specific Land Workers Alliance kind of protest. We had a gathering outside the Scottish Parliament. We had, I think, around 200 people over the course of the day. We had small-scale farmers and crofters talking about their work and how the government could better support them. And then we served a meal of food that was all produced from small-scale farms. And it was a really lovely day, and loads of the Rural Affairs Committee MSPs came, almost the entire Rural Affairs Committee came, and some of the government officials who work in the area. So it was quite successful at getting this on the agenda, and it was really fun. So that was kind of launching our small farms campaign. And then in terms of what's next in Scotland, so we've had a small win in that the Scottish Government is going to pilot a new small farms grants scheme which doesn't have an income threshold. So people with a higher income than 32,000 will still be able to apply for this. It's really in the early proposal stage, so we're not sure what that will look like, but we're going to be on the committee, so we'll try and guide it in a direction that's useful. We're going to have a kind of big open meeting with different organisations who might want to be involved and individuals who want to be involved in the campaign. So if that's anyone who's watching this and you're interested, get in touch with me and you can come along. A big meeting on how we want this campaign to go. We've got farm visits planned with MSPs from the Rural Affairs Committee to small-scale farms and crofts. And it's also worth saying the main board advising the government on farming policy going forwards is called ARIOB. I can't completely remember exactly what that acronym stands for because there are so many acronyms. It's got representatives from different parts of the farming industry and the environmental movement, but it has no representation at the moment from small-scale farms. It's got some representation from the Crofting Federation, but other than that, there's nothing about small-scale agriculture, and there's nothing at all about small-scale horticulture. So one of the avenues we're looking at is potentially trying to get onto that board and be part of that conversation. But yes, so that's where we're at in Scotland at the moment.
And I wouldn't actually call it a wee win. It's not just a wee win to win that fact that the small farms pilot scheme will be piloted. Congratulations for your hard work and all the hard work of the campaigners in Scotland who have been pushing for this. Thank you. And now on to Holly for Wales.
Yeah, hi everyone. So I'm Holly. I'm the Policy and Campaigns Coordinator for Wales for Land Workers Alliance, or Gweithwyr y Tir in Welsh. Essentially the same role as Tara, but in Wales rather than Scotland. Just a little bit of context about Wales. Much smaller average farm size in Wales. So the average farm size in terms of number of farms, as not area, is about 55% are less than 20 hectares, and the average farm size around 48 hectares. The majority of agricultural land is used for grazing. Crops and horticulture, so that represent just 2%, and of that 2%, and in total, 0.1% of Welsh agricultural land is for edible horticulture. So it's a really small section of the Welsh agricultural land. That makes up around 200 farms that are fruit and veg farms in Wales. And yeah, as you can see, the majority of Welsh farm income comes from subsidies. It's an interesting, when you talk about small farms in Wales, there seems to be quite a lot of definitions. Different people mean different things when they talk about small farms. So this chart, which comes from the Senedd is the Welsh Parliament, one of the Senedd reports on farming in Wales, they defined around 60% of farms, when they look at type, they lumped in all very small farms together without saying what they're producing. And very small in this context meant less than one full-time equivalent worker. So it's very confusing when you're looking at different farming statistics. Another survey which specifically looked at the motivations of small and very small farmers defined very small farms as having an income of less than 25,000 euros. So again, looking at a different context. So it's odd that a lot of the talk of small farms is about income and employment, not about actual size. But I'm going to talk about the impact on farms in terms of size of the policy in Wales. And yeah, just to go on the horticulture, although yeah, you can't tell from this graph, but as I said, there's about 200 fruit and veg farms in Wales. Of those, around 117 in 2020 were less than 5 hectares. So more than half are less than 5 hectares, which means that to date they have not received any of the payments under the cap, because in Wales the current threshold is 5 hectares. The Wales has also got a new agricultural bill going through the Senedd and a new sustainable farming scheme which sets out the detail of what will replace the cap. The structure of the scheme, it starts with all farms that are in the scheme have to meet minimum requirements. So those are sort of environmental, animal health, all those regulations. They're not currently planning to actually change any regulations in Wales, but what they are planning to do is synthesise all sorts of legislation that's in different acts and places into one set of national minimum standards to make it easier for farms to know, okay, am I actually meeting these? So those that meet those standards can then apply to the sustainable farming scheme. This is all planned to come in 2025. And then the scheme itself has 3 different parts to it. So there's the universal actions, which everyone in the scheme will have to comply with. And those are, for the most part, those are monitoring reporting requirements. So that will include things like soil tests, but also things like KPIs for business. And they're not actually required to change, so that specific requirements for the soil aren't, for example, sort of levels of soil carbon or nitrogen aren't required, but they have to report on what they are for the universal actions. There's also things like hedgerows and sort of 10% for nature, 10% of your land for nature, 10% of land for trees, which has caused a lot of controversy, and various others specific to the landscape, depending on whether you have peat or historic ponds and such like. Then, so that payment will be universal. That universal payment will be area-based. Then there are optional actions, and so this is where farmers can get additional income over and above the universal, and that there's a whole list of loads of different, and there's actually some really good, interesting things in the optional actions. And some of them would be very good for small farms. So for example, there is a specific one for a horticultural enterprise, and that's either on an existing farm or a new horticultural enterprise. So it could be, on an existing livestock farm or a standalone. There's also things like public engagement and open days education, which, as Jyoti mentioned, is a big part of what a lot of small farms do. And as well as various things that are much more related to soil carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and other environmental benefits. And then there's collaborative actions. And so these are looking at both landscape scale collaborations, so across a particular bioregion, a particular river catchment, or such like, but also collaborative actions across the supply chain, as suggested. So that could include working with retailers, for example. But this is very vague at the moment. So although Wales started on this process in 2018, so was ahead of Scotland, it's actually currently probably about the same level as Scotland, because there's been consultation after consultation, and it's still pretty vague on that bit. So what do these mean for small farms? As just a comparison, so in terms of the limit for eligibility, before Brexit and currently, it's 5 hectares. And the new proposal is for it to be 3 hectares. So progress, but we've still got an area-based limit. Previously, there was 3 hectares for certain grants and certain environmental payments as well, known as such as Glassdeer, which were agri-environment schemes. Now, the proposal for grants, and some of these grants have actually already come out, so the Welsh Government are announcing grants ahead of the full scheme coming in. So that is now 3 hectares or evidence of 550 hours worked for some of them, or actually, it's not on the slide, but evidence of accounts or that you are running a commercial business, essentially. And this is actually a real win. This is something that we have campaigned for together with allies in Wales, that there should be the criteria should be based on, are you running a land-based business, not do you have X amount of land. So we're really pleased about that. And those grants are mostly capital grants, and although some of them still relate to area. So it's, yeah, that's very. As I said, so under CAP, the majority of all support was area-based, and that the universal will, under the Sustainable Farming Scheme, will still be area-based. There will be, as I mentioned, there are some grants aimed at horticulture, and so that will be under the new scheme, but there's also been some interim grants, including a horticultural startup grant and a horticultural development grant, and neither of those had an area-based requirement. So farmers beneath the 3 hectare limit can still apply for them. There's various other support in Wales, such as Farming Connect, which is an advice service, and they've always had an option of 550 hours worked if you don't meet the criteria on a land area basis, but you can prove these hours worked. Also, previously in Wales, under the CAP, there was an upper limit of 300,000, so that the really large farms couldn't get more than that. There's no mention of that in the new policy, so we don't know if they will be doing that. So on what we've called for, so we've called for eligibility not to be area-based, for startup and development grants, which we've got some of, for funded traineeships. So a lot of our members have trainees, and they're a critical part of the farm, and also there's a critical part of training the next generation. So that's another way that public support can support farms without it being area-based. Bridging the gap between public procurement, so we've argued that there should be a focus on procuring directly from sustainable local produce, and that is but the amount that public sector can afford is significantly less than local farmers in Wales would need to make that worthwhile. So looking at funding that difference between what the farmer needs and what the cheapest the public body could get otherwise. There will be a report on a pilot coming out next week on this. And we've dedicated public goods scheme, which will be based on some of the work Bee's been doing in England, so she can talk about that. Access to market and planning reforms. And just to say, in Wales, planning for permitted development rights for farms only kicks in at 5 hectares, meaning if you want to start a farm and you have less than 5 hectares, you have to go through really difficult planning for all your barns or anything you might need. Not to mention housing. So, but whereas if you've got a larger farm, at least the farm infrastructure is much more straightforward from a planning perspective. I'm going to jump through all of these to get to Bees and leave it there as I'm out of time. Thanks very much.
I also really want to congratulate Holly on the amazing work to get the horticulture grant scheme and that threshold reform and things through, because that's no small win either. And due to the hard work of
Hello, good morning. I'm Rebecca, otherwise known as Bee, and I'm the Horticulture Campaigns Coordinator for Land Workers Alliance. But in this context, I'm going to be talking about all small farms, not just horticulture. So we often look with envy at over the borders at Wales and Scotland, just because it sometimes feels like there's a bit more flexibility there. But we also find it quite useful being able to compare notes and use a bit of leverage across the borders to say, well, look, they're doing this in Wales or Scotland, can we do this in England? And there are often some really good ideas that come across from there. But I'm going to talk about the picture in England. So I'm just going to whiz quickly through these first couple of slides just to get everyone up to date. So since the Brexit vote in 2016, Land Workers Alliance, well, even before that, ever since it began, Land Workers Alliance has been lobbying for small farms and agroecology. But since 2016, we've been really supporting and pushing for the public money for public goods, and actually found that a really encouraging step in the right direction. So fast forward to 2021, when the Agriculture Act and the Environment Act both passed, and we did a lot of lobbying to make sure that agroecology was included and mentioned in there, and did have some small wins along the way. And so the outcome of all of that was that the public money for public goods concept was written into legislation, and the actual on-the-ground manifestation of that is environmental land management schemes in England, otherwise known as ELMs. And one of the things that I actually think DEFRA have done really well is they've been really trying to co-design ELMs with land managers, farmers, environmental organisations, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But one of the things that they've done with that is run these tests and trials to enable organisations like Land Workers Alliance to put forward ideas and proposals, and then to fund those organisations to run tests and trials with those proposals. So this slide was the latest when I wrote it before Christmas, but actually it's been superseded by the announcement that Jyoti spoke about at the beginning. But yes, the Environmental Land Management Scheme in England can be divided into three parts. There's the Sustainable Farming Incentive, or SFI, which is the more broad-based, universally accessible scheme targeted at farmers, and I think DEFRA are aiming for about at least 70% of farmers to be applying for this. So the aim is to get farmers above the regulatory baseline to a slightly higher level of sustainable land management. And they focus on assets which are they've very much focused the whole scheme around the idea of natural capital and ecosystem services. And in that terminology, assets are things like soil, hedges, grassland, and basically the fundamental assets that systems are based on. And so Sustainable Farming Incentive, or SFI, is based on things called standards, which are sets of actions that the applying farmer has to do to look after their assets really well. And on the whole, they tend to be in three levels. So you enter at basic, and then there's intermediate and advanced, and you get payments per hectare. But they are very much an area-based scheme, and they've been quite poorly received because on the whole, the payments really aren't very high per hectare, and there just isn't sufficient payment to encourage people to take part. So then the other scheme which has been worked on since the beginning is landscape recovery. And this is much more ambitious, large-scale projects across landscapes such as the Lake District in Cumbria, the upland farms, or large-scale wetlands, or big regional rewilding projects. And this is all still going to go ahead. Between Sustainable Farming Incentive and Landscape Recovery, there was going to be a level called Local Nature Recovery. But on the 1st of December, DEFRA announced that they were going to drop Local Nature Recovery and replace that with a Countryside Stewardship Plus scheme. Hence, that isn't a typo on the slide. That's been slashed out and replaced by Countryside Stewardship Plus. And the justification by Therese Coffey was that Countryside Stewardship is working and there's no need to reinvent the wheel. So in her words, it's going to have the same ambitious outcome. But others have said, well, it's a watered-down substitute for the world-leading overhaul that farmers were promised. That's the National Trust, quoted on the BBC. So this was quite a disappointment to us in Land Workers Alliance, because actually we had quite a lot of hope pinned on local nature recovery. But we're actually thinking, well, as long as they really include the plus bit to countryside stewardship, then all is not lost, and there are actually quite a lot of possibilities. So I'm just going to go very briefly into what we mean by small farms. I haven't got any of the really good analysis that Tara and Holly have done, but yes, we're focusing on an area-based definition of small farms, and in particular 5 hectares and less, which is the small farms that are currently excluded by the 5 hectare threshold. But we're not being absolutely hard and fast about campaigning for farms with 5 hectares and less, because particularly for pastoral and arable farms, farms of 20 hectares or even larger are still considered small farms, and still on an area-based payment scheme stand to lose out significantly if the schemes remain area-based, because the payment rates per hectare are just so low. So what have LWA been doing for small farms in England? Well, we've been really, really active over the last few years, in particular Jyoti, but also myself and other people in the team. Since fairly early on, Jyoti has been on the ELMS External Engagement Group, advocating for small farms and agroecology, with about 40 or 50 other organisations, ranging from the National Trust and the NFU and the RSPB to Sustain and the Soil Association, and a whole broad range of organisations. And they really work very hard, quite often having whole day meetings once a week sometimes. And they've been able to get prior access to policies and comment on them before they've been made publicly available. So that's been really valuable. Then we applied in 2019 to run one of the tests and trials, and we decided to really focus that one on horticulture, because that was somewhere where we felt we could really win, because horticulture across the board is done on a much smaller area than livestock or arable farming. And we were successful in getting our first proposal accepted, and we ran a test and trial, which I'll talk about at the end, for 15 months. And then we were really pleased when we were invited to extend it. So we're now in phase 2 of the Growing the Goods test and trial. There's also a small farms working group, which I'll talk about on the next slide. And now we've also got a DEFRA contract to run the new entrant support scheme in the southeast and southwest of England. But we've also been working hard on background advocacy for small farms, including farm study tours, which are really one of the most effective ways, I think, that we campaign, because we get groups from DEFRA out onto small farms to actually see that they're working. And I think that really helps, because there's such a myth that only large-scale farms are viable, and so we really have found them to be effective. We've also been lobbying on the Farm Equipment and Technology Fund, and putting DEFRA in touch with members for working groups and interviews. So I will just skip through. These are some of the issues that the Small Farms Working Group has been focusing on. That all probably seems quite familiar from the other presentations. And I think you'll probably be all very familiar with all the things that small farms do so well. So I just wanted to focus in on the last couple of slides on public engagement, which this was something that small farms do really, really well. And it was originally part of ELMS, but it seems to have been quietly dropped. So we're really lobbying hard for that to be picked up again, because really for public acceptability of elms, especially in a time of fiscal crisis, I think it's really important that the public understand why money is being put into farming. And it's essential for the public and the markets to be supporting the kind of changes that elms is putting forward, for them to be pulling in the same direction rather than going in opposite directions. So we're working in partnership with Countryside Trust and other organisations to really lobby for more public engagement in elms. And we see that there's an opportunity to reinstate this with the shift to Countryside Stewardship Plus. So finally, I'll just quickly whiz through the Growing the Goods Horticulture Elms trial. And we've been basically working with now nearly 100 growers, not just small ones, but quite large ones, to help them to identify the public goods actions that they're already doing and to develop ways for them to create land management plans and map them. And we've done this by creating a catalogue method for them to select public goods actions, which luckily actually is quite similar to the Countryside Stewardship Scheme. So hopefully can actually translate across quite well. And we're aiming to provide flexibility for a diversity of landscape types and scales of business. And the particularly exciting thing I think about what we've been doing is we've been looking at ways to try and move away from an area-based payment to measuring public goods actions in more appropriate units. So, for example, if you're talking about trying to incentivise a move away from peat-based growing media, it makes more sense to measure that in cubic metres of peat rather than hectares. Or if you're talking about rainwater harvesting or substituting river water extraction, again, cubic metres is more appropriate. So the land management plan method that we're using enables growers to layer the different public goods actions onto the same area of land, so get a much higher payment, hopefully, for doing lots of things on a small area. And we are also developing SFI standards for market gardens and orchards, with the first hectare paid at a higher rate than subsequent hectares. And that's the end. Thank you very much for listening.
Well done. And congratulations, B, on all the hard work with the test and trials. At the meeting with DEFRA earlier, they did say that they are going to move forward with the horticulture standard, and it will largely be based on the hard work from the test and trials. So that's a win as well. And now on to Bridget to talk about Ireland.
Okay, great. All right, speak about Ireland. It was really funny because I come from the south of Ireland, which is the Republic, and I kind of feel it's really, really funny. We're talking about 4 nations and a republic, and it sounded like 4 weddings and a funeral. But it is really important, I suppose, just to kind of make that distinction that Southern Ireland is still within the CAP system, and Northern Ireland not. And I'd spoken to Yali about this, and she had said that was great. And then she said, you know, maybe you could just throw in a little bit about Northern Ireland. And I went like, what? It's 20 miles up the road, and I know absolutely nothing about what's happening in Northern Ireland. And I think that point actually needed to be made. And I'm embarrassed to say that, you know. I'm embarrassed to say that I've spent a huge amount of time on the CAP and looking at subsidies and whatever. And we don't even look at what's happening next door. And I'm finding it quite interesting listening to the speakers here and seeing that we've got 5 different systems in a land area based. Nature knows no boundaries. Our streams know no boundaries. We share land, we share an island, we share this planet. And yet we're divvying it up when it comes to the subsidies. And I thought that was just a really interesting kind of comment to make. Forgive me for using my computer. Needless to say, it was one of the reasons I didn't have a slideshow, was because I was still running around like a headless chicken trying to find out what's happening up in the north. I am now a whole bunch more informed, but just so that I didn't severely embarrass myself, I had a long chat to Phil Carson's yesterday, and he plugged me in. So he sent me some of his notes from his presentation yesterday. and I've just knocked it out. And so I'll be having to kind of refer to this quite a lot. But for the Northern Ireland part, I'll start with that. And a big thanks here to Phil Carsons for his information. So the average farm size in the north, you're looking at about 30 hectares as your average. And 85% of your land use would be around livestock and what's needed for feeding livestock. Like the other parts of the UK, Northern Ireland has begun its process of developing its new agricultural payments to replace the EU's cap. It's crucially important as we have, so I'm actually reading his notes, so forgive me when I say we. I mean, I'm not the bottom side of the island, I'm talking about the we on the top side of the island. But it's just that we have significant problems in relation to water quality, agricultural greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity loss, and the impact of market volatility on the agricultural sector. So they've seen some movement in the space with the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs publishing a series of high-level priorities for the post-Brexit agricultural policy framework. These are built around increased resilience, productivity, environmental sustainability, and supply chain functionality. And again, we're seeing all these words that we've been calling for ages. They're popping up, but when you unpack them, they have absolutely no relation to how we understand them, okay? So in early 2022, just before the most recent collapse of the Northern Ireland Assembly, the minister outlined how some of the payments would change in the coming years. And interestingly enough, again, you know, as I'm reading this, the most recent collapse, well, I mean, how on earth are we supposed to be trying to implement stuff when your governance system keeps collapsing? You know, it's not to say that you need active people. I mean, there was that wonderful comment from the Swiss delegate in the plenary or whenever the other day saying, you know, you don't need full-time paid politicians to be delivering this, but you do need functioning governance. And obviously, if that's in a bit of a spot of bother, well, it is going to impact on things. So essentially, the outline of how the payments would change in the coming years. So they're going to maintain, at the moment, the 310 million budget that the North gets for the subsidies is going to be maintained till 2024. After that, it's unknown. The budget, as I said, is to deliver resilience. It's made up of the basic payment with a soil nutrient health kind of piece built into it. But again, they're looking at chemical nitrogen, NPK plus lime. Now, in the south, we also, this last year, the government ran a soil nutrient plan that farmers could avail of. It was limited, only 7,500 farmers out of 139,000 could avail of it. But it came with those little strings that get attached to things, all right? So they were happy to go and measure your soil, check out your NPK, check out your carbon, check out the pathogen load. But then when you signed up for the free test, you had to sign up for delivering whatever they said would be the results. So if they turned around and said that you needed X many 100 kilograms of lime per hectare thereafter, you get the free test, but you're now committed to actually throwing out the lime and everything else that they were asking you to do. So I think that, yeah, we need to look at that. But anyway, so there's plans to develop a farming with nature scheme, which will reward farmers to adopt more nature-friendly practices. The results will be based on results-based payment style. However, unlike the rest of the UK, Northern Ireland has decided not to underpin future agricultural policy and payments through a Northern Ireland Agriculture Act. This brings several challenges which risk stalling a transition to more regenerative farming and land management. So without a domestic framework legislation, we're left without a specific transition period in which the new policy has to be developed, while the legal basis for payments is covered within the UK Agricultural Act. So again, he makes the point that this risks stalling the pace of change and could allow for the maintenance of an unsustainable status quo for a lot longer than is necessary. Where the smaller farmers fit into that, I would imagine, and we have seen this between the north and the south. In Ireland, when we talk about small farmers, we never really kind of talk about 5 hectares or smaller. Small farmers are the ones that haven't modernized to the point that you're driving big machinery and you haven't intensified. So there's that small is almost regenerative straight away just falls into small farming, even if you're actually doing it with 100 or 100,000 hectares. You're still small because you haven't gone big, all right? And big and small obviously come with the connotations, you know what I mean? Good, bad, there you go. So down in the south, we moved to the old republic there, which is forging ahead. Sorry about that. Our average land size is about 32 hectares. Our main use would be livestock, small tillage, and absolutely tiny horticultural. We import most of our fruit and veg. I mean, for a country that kind of lived and crashed and burned and then lived a bit more on the potato, we only have one seed potato in Ireland. We actually import all of our seed potatoes from Scotland. But now with Brexit, that's looking pretty dodgy. But it is really, really interesting to see that you have this country with this incredible potential to grow vegetables, and we don't, because once again, vegetables are just seen as small. It does, though, place an incredible opportunity for where what we're talking about now is smaller farmers, you know, people on smaller land holdings, people who are working with smaller labor units, family units, the production of fruit and vegetable, you know, like local fruit and vegetables, and things like raw meat and raw milk and meat are a really kind of like amazing opportunity, especially around the local food market for that. Well, not local food supply. And certainly if we could start matching things like procurement up with that, the opportunity increases massively. So when we look at sort of CAP, I mean, I suppose sometimes I sit and think that the poor people in Tallaght Bio who are listening to me, oh, by the way, did I mention I was from Tallaght Bio? Okay, sorry. Tallaght Bio, meaning living land. It's the Irish equivalent of land workers. We very small, started off kind of really recently, just before the lockdown. Well, you know, COVID. So there we are. But I was just wondering that maybe they always kind of think maybe they should be sending somebody with a more subtle tongue, you know. But anyway, so if I had to summarize this new CAP, I mean, essentially, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Has to be the analysis there. Small unproductive farms to go, bigger precision farmers to rise. The definition of production still only being linked to livestock tillage and that bigger horticultural kind of sector. The creative diversification that we see coming from small farms. And I mean, even for myself, I'm wanting to transition to bees, wildflower meadow seeds, and agroecology. Production of seeds is not defined as a farming activity. You know, bees are not a livestock unit, and apiculture. Ireland does draw down an amount from Brussels for its apiculture. It is a whole 125,000. I mean, that is Ireland's national budget for apiculture from the CAP. I mean, yeah, I'll let it speak for itself. And then the final thing to say really about summarising this new CAP is that in 2015, the UK was one of 17 member states that flattened its payments from the earlier iteration, which was the historical snapshot of 2000, 2001, 2002. So back in those what were called the reference years, farmers were assessed on their productivity. And just for people who don't know, productivity wasn't what you put into the supply chain. Productivity wasn't, Lynn Cassells was speaking yesterday about, you know, even what she and her partner feed herself over the year is a massive contribution, and it needs to be measured. Those contributions aren't measured, but what was measured was how many animals you flip through your books. At which point, you get people with really, really, really high payments, and you get people with pretty low payments, especially in the high nature value areas, or anywhere on that kind of like marginal, kind of like western seaboard. The payments are really, really low. So we get to 2015, and Ireland says, yes, it's going to kind of go now into area-based payments. So what we did was we took how much you got under the historical snapshot, we divided it by the number of hectares you own, You put an equal sign, and now we have an area-based payment. We didn't change anything, we just changed the formula, all right? So, for example, I now have an area-based payment, or I did in 2015, and it worked out at 26 euros per hectare. I mean, that was me. That was what I had to run my farm on. My farm, I have 125 acres, a lot of it a mountain land. I have a phenomenal amount of fencing. And anybody can figure out how far 125,000 is going to take you in terms of fencing your land. It was negligible. Whereas, say, for example, the neighbor right next to me on the same land, under the same GAIACs, the same conditionality, was getting 48,000. And, it's just those inequalities, and I do want to keep coming back to the word inequality, because where it underpins subsidies, it transforms the nature of the relationship that you can have with your neighbors, with people around you. It breaks down trust, it breaks down loads of stuff. People would always say, in the old days, we were all in the same boat together. And so we helped each other. There would have been concepts of mehels, and, you would get together and help people harvest. You would get together, and that all stopped when one neighbor got the ability to kind of whiz around on his tractor, and the other person, like myself, is still standing out in the field with a pitchfork. He's looking at me as if to say, well, sell up and get out, and I'll buy your farm for you. And I'm looking at him and thinking, wouldn't you bring your tractor and take it for a spin in my field? But the long and the short of it is, that inequality that underpins how we distribute money fundamentally changes the nature of the relationship that you can have with other people. And when we're talking about solidarity and building community, it really is important that equality and justice start underpinning some of this stuff. And we talk a lot about justice in transition when we talk about environmental stuff. But in Ireland, we still fluffing around the edges of that in agricultural payments. So before I look at kind of what we did get delivered, I just want to pick up some of the few things that Taoiseach Beo called for when that new CAP was strategic plan was being drawn up. We wanted to see that transition to agroecological farming systems. We wanted to see that move away from a focus on industry and agribusiness and growth and global markets towards that focus which secures future livelihoods. And I mean, I think livelihoods was something we really need to look at when we're looking at small-scale farming for family farms, building resilience, thriving communities. We wanted ecosystems to be supported rather than the commodifying of the nature kind of products that are coming off of it. And obviously, your food sovereignty and care and well-being. We wanted to see a rights-based CAP strategic plan built on human rights, the rights of family farmers and people who work in rural areas. So you're looking at the UN drop coming in, the Sustainable Development Goals and the obligations accorded to nature in the form of water and habitat and bird and other directives. We wanted Irish citizens to have access to high-quality food produced by farmers, earning a fair wage while they regenerated those ecosystems and soils, and local food to be affordable to all people. I mean, one of the things that is always so clear is that even when you get into the organic market, it's how are you going to get the most for your product? How can you identify the highest end of the market when actually it's the average person out in the country who's suffering from what we're now calling a cost of living crisis, who actually needs to eat proper food? Agroecological farmers in Ireland are not represented at the stakeholder tables. Taoiseach Beo is not at the stakeholder table. We're not recognised as an agricultural stakeholder. And so what we see when we hear the government talking about that they've consulted with all agricultural stakeholders, they've consulted with all of the business as usual and all of their traditional stakeholders, but they're not letting in this new kind of like approach. We wanted the eco schemes in Pillar 1. We wanted 100% convergence from the start of the new CAP. We wanted, at least, as I say, that equality. If you're going to be asked to do a whole bunch of stuff, whether it's the GAIACs, the good environmental and agricultural and environmental conditions, that we should at least be paid the same amount for trying to deliver them. And Thanks. All people who work on and produce off their land should be able to access payments. The ecosystem schemes, as I say, would just be about regenerating ecosystems. And then if we wanted to increase organic farms, we needed better support, just to let people know. I don't know what the organic farm status is in any of the other nations, but Ireland is under 2% organic farms. So while all of the other EU countries are aiming for 25% organic, we're aiming for 7.5%. And we think that's absolutely amazing, and we have a very clear idea that we're not going to get there. But we are going to give it a go. And then I just want to kind of say, you know, around, we looked around some of the stuff around women farmers as well, saying that women, young trained farmers are considered a vulnerable category and in need of assistance. Well, to get started. And what we were saying is that women should be put, especially women who farm on their own, should be put into that category, which allows them to at least go up to the average payment. And that we should have equal access to all CAP resources, equal access to land, and to be able to use our land without disturbance. Because in some really wild areas in Ireland, we still do kind of find John B. Keane's The Field, in that where a woman becomes a widow, or she's now as productive as unproductive land and needs to be moved out the way. So I'm just, sorry, I'll just two seconds there on the CAP. What we got was a basic income support payment, okay, which has nothing to do with basic income. All it's going to do is shift that convergence that I was talking about. So under the old cap, we got to 65%. Under the new cap now, we're going to go to 85%. So by 2027, we will still not have equality in terms of payments, let alone moving beyond that, which is what the speakers here are speaking about. I won't go into kind of more of the stuff. Oh, the other thing is that the increased ambition that we were supposed to see in the cap, our Department of Agriculture has divided it into two. Business as usual will be delivered by themselves and Chaggas and Board Beer. And then the increased ambition will be outsourced to consultants, and 8 programs will be run through the country on a budget of 1.5 million. 75 million of that, by the way, is straight away earmarked for the people who are delivering it. So the farmers are straight away only getting half of that. But what we're seeing in terms of the environmental kind of stuff is that the government and the Department of Agriculture and everything is carrying on as business as usual, and all the changes are just outsourced and delivered by consultants. Sorry about that.
I'm sorry about that. It's so nice to have Talavera here, and like that it's formed, and we've got, you know, solidarity with another Via Campesina food sovereignty group working across Ireland, alongside the Land Workers Alliance in the other parts of the UK. It's brilliant. Thank you. So welcome to our online audience. We're going to take some questions, starting from the online audience. We've got about 12 minutes for questions now, so quick answers, please. 20. Okay, 20. Oh, sorry. Here we go. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Welcome to the online audience. We've got a question from Sam, who's joining online, directed at Tara, I think. Sam asks, is the Scottish Government able to ban gene editing and implement labelling in agreement with EU standards?
I've already got a microphone. Yes, I think so. I'm afraid I haven't done as much work on that as I maybe would like to in future. But as far as I'm aware, that's devolved. And I think there's currently a moratorium on it at the moment while they work out what to do. So that's certainly something that we work on as the Land Workers Alliance, and that is separate in Scotland. And that they will push the alignment with the EU when they're making those decisions.
Mm-hmm. More questions?
There's one at the back. Oh, the lady at the back had her hand up first.
Thank you very much for all that detail. My name's India Hamilton, and I'm from Jersey, where small is another scale down. And small-scale agriculture has gone through the similar processes. One thing that's come up in my work, and it's a kind of question/interest, is what about subsistence farmers and farmers that eat their own land and therefore can't be businesses, but provide an awful lot of biodiversity, food security, etc., etc. How at the moment I don't see any reference to those farmers, and yeah, I think that's it really. So it's about the people who don't need or want to do business but play an integral role. Have you thought of that?
Do you want to? Sorry. Yeah. Do you want to talk about that? Or? No, okay. Well, in England, with the elms, they talk about land managers as well as farmers. I think the sustainable farming incentive is just for farmers, isn't it? But the others, or is it?
Well, if you're producing food for yourself, that's also producing food.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's something that, at the moment, I mean, up till recently, we've actually been campaigning for there to be an active farmer clause in policy, because there's also been the problem that people who own land but aren't actually farming it have been able to claim subsidies, which doesn't seem to be such a fair thing. So you need to be incentivising people to be producing food. It's a bit of a grey area, I would say, at the moment. And one of the problems that we have with making the case for small farmers is that they say, well, if you take away the 5 hectare threshold, what is there to stop people with large gardens applying for subsidies? And then that gets into a whole other category of complication and admin. And so we've been having to think quite carefully about. So I think we have been looking more towards people who are running small businesses and aren't subsistence, whereas it's not to say that there isn't a role, and a really, really important role, for subsistence, but it's a much trickier thing to argue for subsistence growers to get subsidies. I don't know whether Tara or Holly, you've got something to say for the crofters, because that.
Yeah, so in terms of what we've been talking about in Scotland, when we've been talking about removing minimum thresholds, one of the things that, to receive grants, one of the things that comes up is, well, what would we base it on? And we have often been talking about the Irish system, where there is no minimum threshold, and that does require you to have an active farming business. But I recognise that, yeah, that then becomes a real issue in terms of subsistence farming and what you have to do with an active business. Can that just be selling some eggs to your pals, or like what that would count as? I think we've been talking about the idea of it being based more like the Welsh system, on the number of hours that people are putting into it. Is this like a major part of your life is farming? So I think that is a direction that it could go. I think it is interesting in terms of the crofting perspective, in that some people are crofting and running businesses, and some people are crofting from a subsistence perspective. The funding that you can get specifically for crofting is for agricultural things only, so it's not kind of like income support. It would be, for infrastructure, and most of it's spent on fencing, as far as I'm aware. And that doesn't, that you don't have to be running a business for that. That can be for your own subsistence farming. But I think that I'm not sure how that applies and I think that would also be the same in terms of area-based payments once you're using the common grazings. But yeah, I don't have a really clear answer, but I think it's a really useful point.
And for us down in the south, under the cap, under the eco section of your payment, farmers can now apply to be part of the eco scheme, even if they don't have the basic income supplement payment from the previous section. So if you are perhaps subsistence farming, but you're prepared to implement the eco scheme, then you can actually apply for that part of the grant, even though you don't have the link to the productive side. So there has been that kind of shift, that if kind of critical environmental conditions are being, products are being delivered, even if you're not running a full kind of food production off the other side of it. But the other part of it is that I think we do need to kind of challenge how we understand what makes that farm productive. And up until now, it really has only been around food. But say, for example, where you're looking at people in high carbon-based soils, literally in peatlands or bogs, where it's around food or livestock or tillage, those lands have to be drained, and so you run into the conflict of the environmental bit. So if you stretched your imagination and then said, well, peat production via, say, growing sphagnum moss is now classified as a productive use of a farm, you could stretch that growing seeds should be an agricultural activity, you know?
Just in Wales, we have focused on commercial farming, and part that's been strategic in our campaigning because there's very much a perspective in where, like, what we come up against is farms less than 5 hectares or potentially now 3 hectares are hobby farms, and Welsh Government doesn't have the capacity to manage all the payments to everyone. And then there's a sort of dismissiveness from a lot of the more conventional farming sector. And so although self-sufficiency is a really valuable contribution, we've just had to say, okay, well, if you're going to have a threshold or an eligibility definition, that we have said it can be about business, and that's part of shifting the understanding of how much land it takes to run a business, and specifically with horticulture, because there's very little understanding of area and the economics of horticulture businesses in Wales. So unfortunately, we have focused on that, but it's kind of based on the sort of political reality that we're in, and it's not because we don't think self-sufficiency is valuable.
I think we could eventually move into positions similar to the One Planet development policy, or the kind of metrics that we're using to try and justify agricultural workers' dwellings, being put forward that give an economic value to that subsistence, and that potentially, like, as this evolves and as politically it becomes something that's more feasible for us to promote, then, it would be possible to say, add in an economic value to the self-sufficiency that was provided and show that as part of the viability of an active farming business. There's definitely systems that could be adopted, but we just have to be quite strategic and, careful about how we do this, because even pushing the thing out for commercial small farm businesses is something we're really, like, on the front line of doing right now, and then I think we can move towards that in the future. The other thing I wanted to point out is that the public money for public goods scenario is actually not about food production, it's about ecosystem services. So the majority of the payments that are coming out from English government now are earmarked for the ecosystem services that are delivered. That means, the space you provide for wildlife, the soil that's looked after, etc. On quite a lot of what is being, put out there, it's not actually about food. It's about those other services being provided.
Yes, and that would be the difference between Ireland and England at the moment.
Quite a few other questions.
It is quite different in England, what's happening, than the other 3 nations.
The lady there in the 4th row back, yes. And then the gentleman with the beard, I think they both.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Arizona Muse. I'm from DIRT, which is an organization that works closely with the biodynamic farming movement. My question is about certifications and subsidies. Are governments able to accept kind of help or rely on certifications in order to deliver subsidies, and could that ever happen, or would there just talk me through that?
I could talk a little bit about that. Certainly in the Growing the Goods trial, we've been strongly putting forward for organic certification, and also leaf mark to be considered as a sort of fast track towards getting the payment. So you get a payment which would cover your certification fee, some of your admin time for doing the work around certification, and then an environmental bonus. We're also, well, I think there is going to be an organic SFI standard, or there was,
no, it's
at least.
Under countryside stewardship, it's an option.
Yes, and if they're keeping countryside stewardship, we need to be pushing for that to be kept as an option. But we certainly see that there should be payments for organic and other forms of certification. Do you want to? You go.
Wales previously had a subsidy for organic certification. That finished a few years ago, and then they brought it back this year. There's no mention of organic certification in the sustainable farming scheme, but they have, in conversation, said that they might use certification as a sort of evidence that you've already met the universal criteria, but that's not confirmed. And the organics, the grant that came out recently again it's good, but it's not great for horticulture because again it's a certification, an annual payment for the admin, but it's also area based. So and it's a very low area, and only you get it for 2 years.
The man with the beard in the middle.
Maybe we should take 3 questions.
Yes.
Hello, my name's Tom. I live in the Marches, about a mile from the Welsh border on the English side, and I do quite a bit of work with citizen scientists measuring water quality in the River Wye. And I was wondering, really, do you see a future at all, or any hope, glimmer of hope, for kind of cross-border working in the subsidy system for the Wye? In my view, the 20 million chickens in the Wye catchment that we've currently got under intensive management is 20 million too many, and we need to... The solutions being pushed are very much, let's build AD units and that'll solve all our problems. No one ever talks about the digestate. Will there be subsidies to reduce, or destock even, the chicken farms? Because effectively IPUs, intensive poultry units, are so much more profitable than other farming systems in that area that there has to be sort of financial help to kind of wean them off it.
Do we want to take 3 questions at a time? Okay, I think... there's someone...
We've got an online one.
Everybody's turn.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Just another question from our online audience. Daniel asks, have LWA or other organisations lobbied for farmers to be rewarded for the public goods they've already provided, e.g. maintaining hedges, planting trees, maintaining or extending wetland, etc., usually without any grants, rather than only being rewarded for new provision of public goods?
Yeah, my question was for B, I think, talking about the elms situation. Has there been any discussion, I'm talking as a farmer myself, has there been, a small farmer at that, has there been any discussion about access to the countryside? And that's one thing I'm really passionate about as a keen walker as well, and that we have this appalling urban and rural disconnect, and one of the things that can help to resolve that is if we fix our broken footpath system. Is there any talk about farmers receiving payments for new footpaths, new rights of access, and that perhaps this could be a real win for smaller farms and provide opportunities?
Yes. Should we answer?
So, should we just each devolve nation quick short answer on, is there anything about chickens? Is there anything about public access?
Anything about the old, like...
And maintenance payments for work that's been done before. Do you each want to just do a quick short answer about what the context is?
Well, I'll just answer the last one because the other two, unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to kind of give much of a... Getting paid for new stuff, I mean, getting paid for the old stuff. And under the cap, basically the idea is that what already exists is already accounted for, because a lot of your payments are based on what it's going to contribute to things like greenhouse gas emission targets. So everything that already exists has already been factored in. And so they're just looking at not paying for that. So the answer pretty much is no. The fight obviously is on for that to be explored, especially around things like where you've got bogs. By keeping them wetted, you're stopping a huge amount of greenhouse gases to be released into the atmosphere. That is not something that you're doing as in sequestering, but you're preventing something from happening that does exist. But it takes active management to do that. So surely there should be a payment attached to that.
Okay, just very quickly on the maintenance payments. We're certainly pushing very hard for anyone who's already doing things to have them maintained. But I think under SFI, if you're already doing something, you would get paid for it, even if it's not a new thing. So I think that is baked into the way Elms is going to work. On the access to the land, again, I mean, within public engagement, we're pushing very hard for access and payments for footpaths. We've had one of the participants in Growing the Goods has been really keen to make sure that that footpath maintenance is paid for, and we've got an action within the public goods catalogue for interpretation boards and footpath maintenance payments. At the moment, it's not apparent that that's going to be covered under the proposals, but countryside stewardship does, that does include that. So I think it's quite likely. But up till now, actual maintenance of footpaths hasn't been paid for.
Would this include I'm talking about the introduction of new footpaths as well as maintenance?
Oh, right.
Just
yes.
Because the problem we have as I'm a member of several walkers groups as well.
Yes.
A lot of the footpaths don't go anywhere, so they're not very well used.
Yes.
They might lead you to a dual carriageway.
Right. Yes.
Keep lobbying on it, basically.
Yes.
You know, there's inroads, but if you don't keep lobbying,
yes.
they will not put it in.
Yes. Yes.
Sort of.
So and push for us to lobby too. Yes.
On the existing good work, yes, in the Welsh scheme, for example, the 10% requirement for trees includes trees already on the farm. And they have also said that farmers will get rewarded for work already done previously. It's not clear what the detail of that will mean for some of the other schemes, the other parts of the scheme. On the nitrogen and phosphate pollution in rivers, we have argued that those chicken farms, and it's also an issue with dairy and pig now with intensive units, shouldn't be receiving those subsidies because whatever else they do, they're causing huge amounts of problems. However, it's actually, I think it's more relevant to look at regulation and planning than subsidies, because even if they don't receive subsidies, that's probably not going to stop them, because especially if it is area-based, because those chicken units are pretty small for what they produce. So unfortunately, in Powys, the county that has most of the Y, they just seem to be granting planning again and again, and it's absolutely terrible. And yes, we definitely should be campaigning on both sides of the border about that. I understand that Herefordshire is actually a lot better, and other English counties, and rights of way I think are included in the Welsh scheme, although there's very little detail.
Yeah, in terms of the destocking and incentives for that, the Scottish Agriculture Bill includes a section on animal welfare and improving animal welfare. But basically, yeah, the mechanism we're talking about is having kind of minimum standards for animal welfare, and if you don't meet those standards, you won't get your subsidies. And obviously, as Holly said, even without the subsidies, some of these really intensive units can still continue. So I think that regulation and raising the legal minimum standards for keeping animals is really important, and that's certainly something that we were specifically talking in our kind of response to that consultation about pigs and poultry and the need for incentives to support and incentives to move away from intensive farming. Yes, so I'm not sure where that will go, but it is something that we're talking about. In terms of the good stuff that people have already been doing, that was something that I was a bit concerned about, because obviously, yeah, in terms of supporting our members, so many people are already doing the things that the Scottish Government is now saying they're going to pay people based on the outcomes of doing those things, and people are already doing them. But we have had confirmation from the Minister that previous actions will be taken into account. How that's going to happen, she said that publicly, and she said that I discussed it in a meeting with her. So I think, yeah, that is definitely something that's on their radar. At the moment, it's really unclear. I mean, it's worth saying that everything about the new agriculture bill is pretty unclear, and that's quite stressful for farmers. It's really, people don't know what's going to happen in the next couple of years. It's really unclear from looking at the proposals now how that, they talk about outcomes throughout, so it's very hard to see how they will do that, but it's certainly something that they are really aware of. And we'll just keep pushing on that, and lots of other people are also pushing on that. So I think I'm hopeful about it.
So, Yeah, basically we have to end now, and you have to see this is really complex stuff. And it's stuff that, you know, if we weren't pushing for it, Talambeo, the Land Workers Alliance, and the different organizations, Right to Roam, to, you know, animal welfare advocates, to whoever it isn't going to happen. Because agribusiness has been the one that's advocating for these large-scale industrial farms, for the subsidies to go to big farms for these decades, and we've lost out because of it. So please join with our campaigns, support the Land Workers Alliance. We cannot pay the salaries of the people doing this incredibly detailed work unless people join as members and support us. You can join as a member, that's a farmer member, or as a supporter member, you know, and back up our organization's capacity to do this good work. Because, you know, even on the 1-2 days a week that people are doing this, we're getting incredible results, and we're actually seeing real wins. And you know, by us, you know, lending us both your money and your campaigning capacity and your voice, and coming to all the events we hold, you know, signing the campaigns that we put out there, you're actually making this change happen. So really do those things. These tiny things that we're putting forward can actually make a difference, and the more of it that we do, we can actually reverse this trend.